Okay, I'll get to this in a second. I need to say a few preliminary things. One is, yesterday was an extraordinary experience for me to be here, I think for everybody that I talked to, and I just felt, I woke up this morning thinking yesterday being here was the most important place to be on the planet yesterday. I think something extraordinary was happening, and I really miss Lynn. She always seemed like kind of gravity to me, that the presence is always there, and anyway, now she's not. I teach a course at NYU. I want to say something about her emphasis on images and the importance of communication. I teach a course at NYU called Lessons from the Biosphere. It's for non-science majors. It has labs. I get about 120 students typically when I teach it. And I always tell the students, I'm not here to bust your chops for med school or something. I'm trying to get you to come out of this class with the big things that all Earth citizens should know. And in the section on evolution, of course, one of them is the evolution of the eukaryotic cell and symbiogenesis that I highlight as important as, let's say, the fact that the Earth's atmosphere is not today what it was billions of years ago, and also the extinction of the dinosaurs with the boloid impact. And in some ways it's even more important because it led directly to us, the evolution of the eukaryotic cell. And I always show in that class, I always try to break up the lecture with what I call an organism moment. One time I actually slipped and said it was an orgasm moment to the class, and they loved that. That was really slip. But I always try to show them something cool, and during the part on the right after the origin of life, I've been showing for 10 years a video that Lynn and Dorion did, and Jeremy actually did the music for, which many of you will know, called From Bacteria to Biosphere. Because Lynn always had this emphasis on not just showing the still pictures, but on the moving picture, the live organism. And I find that videotape really fantastic because there's music to it, and there's these images with numbers, and you can narrate it as you want. It's not a PBS thing. It's already narrated. Whoever's showing it can narrate it. So I thought that was really extraordinary. And I'm thinking she may have been one of the first people I ever saw lecture that used videos before you could just embed them in PowerPoint. Really make them part of her lectures. So I just want to give a nod to her emphasis on the visual image and the communication. The second is just a story about how hard she worked. My most recent book was with Dorion, proud to say, called Death and Sex, with Chelsea Green, and I don't know if Joni is here today from Chelsea Green, but she was here yesterday. And so this was part of Dorion and Lynn's science writers imprint of the Chelsea Green Company, which they published many books within. It was a double book. You read one side, and either Dorion's side on sex or my side on death, and flip the book over. Like it was Dorion's idea of an old sci-fi, two sci-fi novellas put together into one book. And so Lynn was just kind of a overseeing acquisition editor in a sense, not official, but of the imprint. And so we had a bunch of emails and phone calls about it, and she was looking at the cover and everything. But even though Chelsea Green had hired a really good line editor to go through the manuscript, one day in the mail, I get my printed manuscript with it gone through, line by line by Lynn, in which sort of blew me away. Like, where does she have time for this? And there were all kinds of references that I should also study before I turn in the final version of the paper that should go into the book. And she didn't say just look at these references. They were all printed out and put at the back of my manuscript and bound in a spiral binding. And then with also a big note on it, with a handwritten note, like, please, no hurry getting this back, but please return it when you're done, too. So I guess it's part of her archives, because I did return it. Now, I want to say just a few words about symbiogenesis and the evolution of the eukaryotic cell. I'm working on a project now that I'm calling From Quarks to Culture. I'm working on a manuscript. And my question is, we all know that things began very simple in the universe. Subatomic particles led to nucleons, and nucleons led to nuclei, and atoms built up, and prokaryotic cells merged to form eukaryotic cells. So there's this sequence of merging that's gone on. And people have said this before. Some people talk about holarchies, holarchical structures. And I just wanted to ask, if I'm very consistent with this, how many steps did it take to get to the modern world? Can I be consistent, and how many of these mergings took place? And are there patterns of mergings? Could we do a science of merging, a science of combining? Or where are the differences? And so it comes out to be about 12. I'm going to talk about science at the top because I'm getting pushback on that when I present that as level 13. They say it's just because you're a scientist, if you're an artist, art would be at the top or something. But I want to just make a remark because obviously Lynn's work has been really important in going from the prokaryotic cell to the eukaryotic cell and understanding that process. And I read her evolution of the eukaryotic cell even before I started grad school because I was already interested in patterns. And it really blew me away, the fact that you can have a fundamental step like that in evolution. And this is now a really important part of what's being called the paradigm of the major transitions in evolution, which some people are saying is really an important way to look at evolution as these steps as you go from prokaryotic to eukaryotic to multicellular. Now, it's a little bit tricky. I'm not going into it now. That there are prokaryotes that develop into multicellularity, but not into complex multicellularity. So the eukaryotic cell was important for complex multicellularity. And I just want to show you something at the end, because I only have a few minutes. Multicellularity happened many times. People are talking about 20 plus times that multicellularity came out of single cell existence. And up at the top is simple multicellularity. These are creatures that are dispersed when they're feeding, but then come together for reproduction and make these great stalks and ball cycles that you've seen in some of Lynn's videos. Complex multicellularity is when you have multiple division of tissues, of functions, of cell types, and life cycle. And I guess what struck me starting to work on this is I knew multicellularity was multiply invented and therefore, in a sense, a form of convergent evolution. But I hadn't realized it was 20 times, 20 plus times. Whereas the eukaryotic cell, this is, I showed from the lecture, but I used Lynn's diagram. The eukaryotic cell seems, for mitochondria, seems to be monophyletic, seems to have been one event. And then there were subsequent endosymbioses, of course, that led to the plastids, and then there's secondary symbiotic events that lead to some of the algae. But I think it's really, this is where I'm starting to, if some of you have ideas about this, because Paul Falkowski was saying that he thinks that the eukaryotic cell, or a mitochondria kind of symbiosis, might have happened many times with other species of bacteria, but they all went extinct and only one made it through. So I don't know if that's true or not, but it is an interesting thing, I think, that the eukaryotic cell seems to be much more of a singular event, at least in that first, well, the mitochondria seems to be a singular event, which is, when you think about it, multicellularity, the idea of major transitions is that once a certain structure has formed, the relations, and I have there, what are the new relations? The relations that come into being with that new kind of being are the raw materials for the building of the next step. So somehow we can trace the relations of the subatomic particles all the way up to the relations of human states, one by one in these buildups. But it looks like the eukaryotic cell, from the prokaryotic cell with the forming mitochondria, we only have one example of that, and we are here because of that one example. Whereas multicellularity, once there was single cells, multicellularity was what could be called Conway Morris calls a design hyperspace. It's a space of possibilities. Multiple lineages went into that space, explored advantages, functional advantages in that space of multicellularity. So I just think it's very, I think that this could maybe be some, either somebody has some answers that's out here right now, or it's just something to think about that I'm proposing in this multiple transitions. And I'm just going to end with science. Why I say science is 13, and I'm going to say something about Lynn because I think she would support me in this. People say, after the state, science, it doesn't seem like the buildup. You'd say, oh, it's the whole Earth. The buildup would be multiple states, multiple nations. The European Union, for example, maybe is level 13 there. But I had science in mind because of the way in the Enlightenment scientists saw themselves as global. It didn't matter what nationality or what culture you were in. You could communicate to anybody, and I saw science as being part of the Enlightenment and universal rights and democracy, so I needed to expand that. But I like to think that Lynn would support that idea of science being an important level of global communication.
Yeah, for the amount of time that I spent with Lynn as an audiovisual technician kind of person, I really don't have very many images at all. But this is one of my favorite ones. And I really wanted to come here today. Well, this whole event yesterday and today is really part of the catharsis for me and for all of us of getting over what happened to Lynn. But mostly I wanted to thank Dorion and Jennifer and Zach and Jeremy for sharing Lynn with us and with me. Lynn's your mother, but for many of us, she's our academic mother, and that's really true for me. So I just wanted to say that first and foremost. I met Lynn in 1980 as an undergraduate student at Boston University. I had work study money, and I was looking for a job, and somebody, maybe Bob Obar, said to me, Lynn Margulis is hiring, and I really didn't know her or anything about her or her lab, but it seemed more interesting than the Xeroxing work that I was doing. So I walked in there, and at the time, Lynn had a screening process for work study students, and she asked a couple of questions. Do you make your bed in the morning? Which I passed that. And are you pre-med? And by that time, I was a sophomore, and I had dropped my pre-med aspirations that I entered undergraduate with. She still asks that. Okay. So, yeah, she was really looking for people who are interested in science. She was not so willing to give time to people who just wanted a letter of recommendation for med school. And so I started as a dishwasher and a media maker, and I really was kind of trained in science in this apprenticeship kind of way, and I was thrown into Lynn's very frenetic and exciting world of science with all of the grad students that you heard from yesterday. Eventually, I took environmental evolution. So in the style of what Jennifer did yesterday, how many of you have taken environmental evolution? How many of you have been TAs for environmental evolution? How many of you have been immortalized in interactive lectures? A few, okay? So the thing I wanted to just share with you is that when, and those of you who have gone through this process know it, when an environmental evolution lecture is made, it's 4 people. It's the speaker and Lynn in the recording booth, and it's a recording technician and often myself taking notes outside the recording booth. And a lot of these happened at Boston University historically. And Lynn would do the verbal equivalent of what she does on the written page with the red pen. She would sort of guide the speaker to give the best lecture that they could give. So the final process, and Jim McAllister is probably familiar with this now, is that you have to edit out all of Lynn's voice. And in those days, editing involved actually cutting the tape. We taped on 1/4-inch reel-to-reel tape, magnetic tape, and then taping it back together, splicing it, right? So some days there was a lot of tape on the cutting room floor that was Lynn's voice. We probably wish that we had that now, but at the time it had to go. Some people mentioned the silver money, the evolution fund, and part of that fund went to copying all of these lectures and transferring the whole system here to UMass. So that was another gift that John Silver gave us inadvertently without his knowing what was going on, probably. So when Lynn moved to Amherst, she brought some of us with her. Dorion, Antonio, Renee Fester, Greg Hinkle, Tom Lang, Jenny Stricker. We all kind of moved together as a unit, and we helped to move the lab. And we all lived very close to each other in proximity. We all lived within a few blocks of each other of Lynn's house that she had. And we would get together very often because we were the only people that we knew in town, have a lot of meals together. And so what I learned from Lynn is, and Andrew kind of illustrated this, there's always enough room for one more person on a field trip, at a lecture, for dinner. There's always room for one more person at the table for dinner, right? And she would invite a lot of people, open invitation practically, to her house for dinner. And she had her own version of the loaves and fishes where she would go into her refrigerator and lengthen the food to feed whoever showed up. And she had this perpetual soup, which she would take out the soup and add to it to make it more. And we joked, I would always joke with Renee, that in that soup were the original, some of the molecules of her original soup that she ever made in the perpetual soup. So, those times were, it was very exciting for me, and she invited me to be a grad student, and I got a master's degree, and I ended up being given opportunities to do many different things that I never would have even imagined, all because I made my bed and I wasn't pre-med. So there are a few people that are close to me and to Lynn who couldn't be here today, and one of them is Barb Doherty. And I just want to read something that she wrote to me that she wanted me to share. First of all, Barb Doherty is a science teacher in the Cambridge public school system. She was an undergraduate at Boston University, and she worked with Lynn, and Lynn introduced her to many great science educators. And Barb is a promoter of active science learning at the high school level. And so she was very concerned that Lynn's educational legacy get mentioned and talked about because it wasn't really mentioned in her obituary. So I'm grateful to Emily Case and what she shared yesterday because it was just perfect, and also Elsa Dorfman, who mentioned some of the very early things that Lynn was doing in Boston and Cambridge. And so this is where Barb starts. She's talking about the science education aspect. This is the aspect of Lynn that I found lacking in all the obituaries I read, that deserves to be commemorated and celebrated. Perhaps her contributions to our understanding of microbial evolution are more august, but in my eyes, the thing that sets Lynn apart is that she was a great teacher. In none of the praise for Lynn does it mention that she developed wonderful elementary science materials that still sing out today as examples of how to engage children in the excitement of learning. Elementary science study and African primary science. These were the curricula that captured my love of science education, and they were among the finest inquiry science materials ever developed. Lynn is the reason that I am a teacher today, and I think many of us can say that, so that's why I wanted to read this. And she is the reason I understand that there is more to teaching than knowing the facts yourself. You must entice your students to observe, ask questions, and structure your own understandings. Lynn developed a course at BU called Environmental Evolution, where all the students were made to be teachers themselves. We read primary literature, listened to interviews with experts in the field, and presented information to the class, with terror of being held accountable by Lynn as the impetus pushing us to prepare well and clarify our ideas fully. We learned the ideas because we had to explain them, and in my teaching today, I make my students do the same. And I think many of us can say that. There's just one more thing I wanted to add. Lynn gave us many great truths we know about her science, Gaia, microcosmos, symbiosis. But she was my champion, and she was our champion in every sense of the word. She championed the microbes, but she championed us. And to Lynn, every one of us in this room was the best at what we did, and she couldn't wait to tell somebody else about it and introduce us to each other. So I think that's among the many gifts that Lynn has given to all of us. That's the gift that we have left. And as Steve Goodwin said, we're all connected to each other, and it's pretty cool. So thank you, Lynn, and thank you to the Sagan and Margulis families.